Hi, you're listening to The Dive, brought to you by Living Word Press, starting right now. Hi, welcome back to The Dive. I'm back with Dr. Josh Waldman and Dr. Gary Yates. We're going to continue our discussion on the Canaanite Conquest and the genocide, or not genocide, hopefully. But last time we talked about can God commit an evil act, and we decided that the overall answer was no. And so now we're going to look at kind of this Canaanite Conquest and say, okay, what are kind of the ways that we deal with this text, looking at it from now?
Yeah, I thought I would jump in here and maybe pitch it over to Gary. I think there have been some answers to this question. We kind of ended the last episode saying, like, this is an hour and a half long dialogue, and even then there's some elements of mystery. But there have been some answers or some interaction on this issue over the years that I think you and I both find sort of problematic or unsatisfactory. I thought maybe you want to maybe speak to some of those.
Yeah, and I'm one of the reasons that I like this discussion is that it's really it's so varied, all the issues that it gets you into.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the fun of it. It's it's ethical, it's biblical, it's theological. There's historical, cultural things that come out of that.
We call it fun, others call it boring.
Yeah, and we'll leave that up to the audience to decide. Which
certainly
of those
wasn't
it is.
fun for the Canaanites.
No, it definitely wasn't that.
But yeah, let's talk about what I see are kind of two extreme, to me, unsatisfied answers, and one of them is something that I've heard sometimes from students or, very conservative people who will just simply say, I don't really understand what the problem is here. The Canaanites were sinners. They deserve death and hell and judgment. We were all sinners. That's what we deserve. So they got what they deserved. And I think just that idea, well, there really isn't a moral dilemma here. That to me is, kind of on the conservative side of is a really, it's just problematic. And I think also just apologetically tone deaf in our culture. So, Josh, what problems does that sort of? There's an element of truth to it, right?
Yeah, I do think it's true that we all deserve. That's part of the gospel is that we deserve hell on the basis of sin. But you use the word tone deaf, and that seems to be the right word. Our culture isn't thinking in those terms, and why is it that God wanted to see some of these folks conquered and killed, and we use the word exterminated, but there are plenty of pretty evil people out there in the world that God doesn't quote unquote exterminate.
Right.
So it does seem like that there's an additional level or layer of judgment that's being executed against these people and by God's people at God's decree. He tells them to do this.
Yeah.
And on top of that, we've got this issue of men, women, and children that constantly gets thrown out here. Are we talking about little kids? Like, what are we doing here? And so I think all of these things together, you've got to realize to the person that isn't necessarily a Christian and they read this is a pretty jarring passage. So I think you're right. It's problematic.
Yeah, and a huge part of our answer will ultimately be God is the creator, God is the judge. The Canaanites were a wicked, corrupt, sinful people that deserve judgment. But the issue that you brought in, like God is using a human army, human agents to do that. And again, in our culture, you can't bring that issue up. The whole idea of holy war or Yahweh war, or whatever you want to call it, without thinking of Islamic jihad or people flying airplanes into buildings. And I think a question that many of us have heard from people that are non-believers is, well, how is your God any different from the God of Islam who commands the killing of infidels and those kinds of things? So it is a morally complex idea, and violence and war and all of those things get thrown into this question. So I think that's partly why that's an unsatisfying answer. The other extreme, though, would be the idea that, well, this is Israelite propaganda. This is you use your God, you use your faith to rationalize a land grab.
Yeah, that's right.
And so this was not God's command. This is simply the Israelites using their faith in Yahweh as a way of rationalizing their violence. So again, flesh out for us a little bit. What are problems for that? Obviously, with for us as evangelical Christians.
Well, I mean, I think it calls into question a lot of the intent of the Old Testament and what
Its authority, right?
yeah, and what it's trying to give us. Like, are we looking at the Old Testament as something that's inspired, that it's coming to us as God's breathed out word, or is this something that's being filtered and we're getting sort of maybe a historical account through a very biased perspective, and it's not necessarily coming to us as God's truth per se.
Yeah, the winners get to write history.
Yeah.
And the winners are telling us we were the good guys and the Canaanites were the bad guys. And there's to me there's a almost sort of Marcionite reading of
Whoa! Are you talking about Marcion here? And here we are on the dive.
Yeah.
We got to stop here
that's true.
for.
We might need
tell
to
us what Marcion. What do you mean by
Well,
Marcion?
Marcion, drew a connection, a distinction between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament, and that the God who is the Father of Jesus Christ is not the Creator God of the Old Testament, and I remember one of the first books that I ever read on this topic was called, Show Them No Mercy, and it was 4 views. And one of the views that was being defended was this idea that this angry God of the Old Testament is not the same God that we read about that's the Father of Jesus Christ. And so, again, that portrayal of God in the New Testament is authoritative for us as Christians, and we have to use that as sort of a grid to correct this angry, violent volcano god in the Old Testament.
That sounds vaguely familiar to some people today. I don't know. I don't know, something like that floating around in church culture today.
It very much is. Just even in evangelical culture, in some of the more progressive forms of it, is that this is, and again, I think we talked about kind of modern sensibilities about violence and these kinds of things, that this cannot be, this angry God who's commanding the Israelites to go out and exterminate people,
right,
is not consistent with the God of the New Testament. And some of this is more. There's more theologically nuanced versions of this. I think of Greg Boyd, who basically sort of adopts this kind of cruciform hermeneutic for the Bible.
Hold on a second. Cruciform hermeneutic.
So in basically reading the Bible through the lens of interpreting the Bible through the lens of the cross.
There we go. Okay.
And so every portrayal of God in the Bible, ultimately has to sort of be corrected and adjusted through it. God always has to look like the God who's on the cross.
Well, there's some truth to that, right?
Yeah. And I think, the ultimate demonstration of the love of God and God's justice and God's love, all of that comes together in a perfect way at the cross.
Yeah.
And the way that, Jesus is lifted up and high and lifted up through his suffering, that's the way that he's exalted. That's what God is like.
Yeah.
But what he ends up then saying about sort of divine violence in the Old Testament is that, well, God in the Old Testament allowed himself to be portrayed this way. But this is not really the way that God is. And so God took this kind of almost like sinful portrayal of himself like the way that Jesus took sin upon himself on the cross. He allowed himself to be portrayed in this way, sort of meeting this culture and, this violent culture where
they were.
Yeah, meeting the culture where it's at. But ultimately we know that this is not what God is really like.
Man, that really changes our conception about inspiration.
Yeah,
and it has a little bit of it calls into question. We talked about the character and attributes of God. I mean, what does that say about a God who reveals himself by allowing himself to be portrayed in a different light? I mean, what do we do with that?
Right, for thousands and thousands of years,
right,
until we finally
entire generations,
until we get the corrective, with Jesus on the cross. And I wonder sometimes with these ideas, like how carefully are we reading the portrayal of Jesus in the New Testament when we allow it? I mean, the book of Revelation concludes with Jesus conducting, holy war on all of his enemies at the end in the final judgment. In that sense, did Jesus or did the New Testament writers? Do we see them struggling with the war and violence in the Old Testament in the way that I think Boyd's hermeneutic is suggesting we should do that?
Yeah.
Hebrews 11 puts the conquest of Jericho and the victories of the judges. Those are great victories that were won by God, through faith.
Right.
And I think about Jesus. I think about him growing up as a Jew and reading the Old Testament, and how he would have framed his view of God. Just thinking about it from a human term, or from a human perspective. Jesus, when he talks about the judgment, for example, of Jerusalem that will happen, when he talks about this in Matthew 24 and the judgment that will come on the city because they've rejected him as Messiah, you've got nursing mothers that better run for the hills, or you've got these women that are grieving at the cross that are going to be part of this just horrible conflagration. He seems to see the validity of divine violence as part of God's judgment as well, right?
Well, something you're getting at there. I mean, it's true that we read the Old Testament. We have the benefit of reading the Old Testament in light of the New. And I'm thankful that we can read and understand where some of these fulfillments were going to ultimately bring us. But like, you can't read the crucifixion and the resurrection without the context of the Old. Right, and so the notion of violence is even there at the crucifixion. Who carries out the violence?
Right.
It's God Himself that's pouring out His wrath, depending on what you do with the atonement. But I'm just saying, violence is all in the gospel because of the severity of sin, and we wouldn't have any framework to understand any of that without some of this language about the severity of sin that's set up for us in the Old Testament.
Right, and then the judgment that's carried out on those that rejected Jesus and Messiah. I mean, Jesus weeps over Jerusalem and says, I wanted to gather you under my wings like defenseless chicks, and but you have rejected me. He can then turn around and say, like, God's judgment and vengeance is going to be poured out on them. And Paul, when he talks about divine judgment and those kinds of things and God's wrath again, how much do you not only have to sort of like correct the Old Testament to arrive at this, but you're
the New.
Yeah, and so red letter Christians,
Yeah.
like we interpret the Bible, we read the red letters, and those are the ones that are authoritative for us. Are they reading all of the red letters?
Yeah,
because we see Jesus, talking about a pretty wrathful, angry God, doing many of the same types of things that we see happening in the Canaanite conquest itself.
It's very true.
Let me just make one last point, and then we'll finish with it. I think another just large problem with Boyd's hermeneutic, and this goes back to something that you said in the previous video, is that violence can't. There's good violence and evil violence, and I don't think all violence in the Bible can be lumped into one category.
Yeah.
Or even the way that we look at war and those kinds of things. Like Exodus 15, the Lord is a warrior, and He threw the horse and the chariot into the sea, and they praise God for that. It's not something like, well, this is a negative view of God that we got to correct when we get to the cross finally. And God there uses His might and His power, and He's the warrior to defend the helpless, oppressed people of Israel, and to throw down this oppressive ruler and those kinds of things. And that's not a one-off event. Violence, used by God, is often done to deliver the oppressed, to execute justice and those types of things. So I think we have to be careful just sort of like categorizing all violence as bad, or it's not all, it doesn't all fit in the same category.
Well, once again, if you say that all violence is evil, then again, what do you do with the cross? I mean, we would say that the cross itself, it's not just the human violence that's being perpetuated against Christ, but the wrath of God. And again, I mentioned the atonement. I realize now what we do with the atonement is come under the attack for the same reason that we're discussing here. But
yeah, it's almost like divine child abuse, those kinds of things, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's come under attack too. But again, how is Scripture painting this? Well, God is pouring out His wrath that we deserve onto Jesus, and so I mean, there's a sense of violence in that. I mean, I don't know if we would like to use that word. I don't know how you feel about that word, that verb here, or that in this case noun, but
Yeah, I think it fits.
Yeah, I think so too. So
this is, I think it's good to approach some of the ways that I think are not helpful, and what we'd like to look at moving forward. Then would be like, what are the reasons that the Bible gives us for why this event did take place?
So what you're saying is we're not actually going to answer the question until week 3 on this topic.
Yeah, we're just going to keep extending it out as long as we can.
I thought they were eventually going to get to it. I'm still waiting. So if you come back and dive in with us next week, maybe I'll find out, you'll find out, and that'll be good.
Cliffhanger.
But, thank you guys. I appreciate you guys.